Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that shaped modern history, the Korean War. A war that began in the shadows of World War II, stretching across the rugged hills of the Korean Peninsula, where nations collided, ideologies clashed, and countless lives were forever changed. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy the type of content that merges myth and mystery. And hey, let us know from where you're watching and what time it is for you right now. It's time now to dim the lights and let's cover what we have for tonight together. When we think of the Korean Peninsula today, the first image that often comes to mind is division. Two nations, two governments, two realities, split by a narrow strip of land known as the demilitarized zone. But to understand how Korea came to be divided, we have to go back to a time when it was one land, one people, and one history, long before foreign powers drew lines across its mountains and rivers. For more than 1,000 years, Korea had been a unified cultural and political entity ruled by dynasties that fostered art, language, Confucian philosophy, and a proud sense of national identity. By the late 19th century, though, the tides of global power began to shift. Imperialism was spreading like wildfire, and Korea, situated between China, Japan, and Russia, became a chessboard for empires competing for dominance in Asia. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea, ending centuries of independence. What followed was 35 years of colonial rule that reshaped the country entirely. Korean language and culture were suppressed. Industries were controlled by Japanese corporations, and the Korean people were forced to labor under foreign domination. Resistance simmered quietly in literature, in classrooms, and in the hearts of those who refused to forget their homeland's spirit. When World War II erupted, Korea was still under Japanese control. But Japan's defeat in 1945 changed everything. As Allied forces advanced, Japan's empire began to collapse. Korean nationalists hoped that liberation would finally mean independence. Yet, in the confusion of the war's end, the fate of Korea was decided not by Koreans themselves, but by the victors of the war. In the final days of World War II, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded from the north, sweeping through Manchuria and into northern Korea. Meanwhile, American forces approached from the south. There was no grand plan for Korea's future, no detailed strategy. In fact, the decision that would define an entire century was made hastily, late at night, by two American officials, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, who were asked to propose a line of division for occupation purposes. Using a National Geographic map, they selected the 38th parallel, roughly cutting Korea in half, as the dividing line. It was a practical choice at the time. The Soviets were already in the north, and American forces could easily enter the south. But no one in that room could have foreseen the enormous consequences of that simple pencil stroke. The division was intended to be temporary. The plan was for both Soviet and American forces to oversee the surrender of Japanese troops in their respective zones and then withdraw, leaving behind a unified, independent Korea. But the reality was far more complicated. The Cold War had already begun to cast its shadow, and what was meant as a short-term arrangement soon hardened into a permanent boundary. In the north, the Soviets quickly moved to consolidate control. They installed local committees, reorganized the economy along socialist lines, and began supporting a young, charismatic guerrilla leader who had fought against Japanese occupation, Kim Il-sung. He was molded into the image of a revolutionary hero, and with Soviet backing, he began to build a new regime that promised equality and land reform, though always under the watchful eye of Moscow. In the South, the Americans faced a far more complex situation. The U.S. military government took charge of reconstruction, but struggled to understand the political landscape. Many Koreans wanted immediate independence, but the Americans feared that rapid change might lead to communist influence. To counter this, they backed Syngman Rhee, a staunchly anti-communist nationalist who had spent much of his life in exile in the United States. Rhee was intelligent, ambitious, and deeply authoritarian, a man who viewed unity under his rule as destiny. By 1948, two governments had formed: the Republic of Korea in the south, led by Rhee, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, led by Kim Il-sung. Both claimed to be the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. Both saw the other not as a neighbor, but as an illegitimate usurper. What's important to remember is that the Korean people themselves didn't want this division. Families were split, trade routes were severed, and cultural ties that had lasted centuries were abruptly torn apart. A single village might find itself divided by the line, with cousins suddenly living under different flags. It was a wound cut into the heart of a nation. Tensions escalated almost immediately. Skirmishes broke out along the border. Propaganda flooded the airwaves on both sides, each proclaiming the other as the enemy. In the north, Kim Il-sung's government spoke of liberation from capitalist oppression. In the south, Rhee's regime vowed to defend democracy against communism. But behind these slogans were ordinary people, exhausted by decades of occupation and war, simply hoping for peace and stability. Meanwhile, the global political climate was hardening. The United States and the Soviet Union were now locked in a global struggle for influence. The Cold War. Every region of the world was seen through the lens of ideology. Korea, a small peninsula far from Washington or Moscow, suddenly became a focal point in that greater battle. In 1949, the situation grew even more unstable. The Chinese Civil War ended with Mao Zedong's communist forces seizing control of China. To many in the U.S. government, this looked like a domino falling, one that could knock down the rest of Asia if left unchecked. Korea was next in line, or so it seemed. By 1950, the two Koreas had transformed into armed camps. Both sides built up their militaries, and both leaders, Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee, began planning for unification, by force if necessary. The border, once just a line on a map, became a front line between two worlds. And that's where the story of the Korean War truly begins. Not with a sudden invasion, but with years of division, tension, and political maneuvering that turned a single nation into a battlefield of global ideology. The 38th parallel, born from a moment of convenience, would soon become one of the most dangerous lines on Earth, and the heart of a war that changed Asia forever. By the time 1948 arrived, the Korean Peninsula, once a single thread of culture, blood, and language, had split into two separate nations, each staring across a dividing line that neither side truly accepted. What had once been one people with a shared dream of freedom after decades of Japanese occupation had now become two competing governments, two ideologies, and two leaders who both claimed to speak for the same homeland. In the north stood Kim Il sung, a man who had risen from obscurity to become the hand-picked leader of the new Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Backed by the Soviet Union, Kim was charismatic, disciplined, and politically sharp. His journey to power was not just about personal ambition. It reflected the Soviet desire to mold a loyal socialist state on their eastern flank. For the Soviet leadership, Kim was the ideal candidate, young enough to be impressionable, yet seasoned enough by guerrilla warfare to inspire loyalty among his people. Kim had spent years in exile and combat, first resisting Japanese rule as part of communist guerrilla forces in Manchuria. During this time, he learned the principles of Marxism, Leninism, studied revolutionary strategy, and forged alliances with the Soviet Red Army. When the Soviets occupied northern Korea in 1945, they saw him as a figure who could command respect, unify various leftist groups, and ensure that Moscow's influence extended deep into Korean soil. Under Kim's leadership, North Korea began to take shape as a model socialist state. Land reform came first. Vast estates and properties, once owned by landlords or collaborators under Japanese rule, were seized and redistributed to poor peasants. Overnight, centuries of hierarchy and inequality were overturned. For the common farmer, it felt like a revolution, but it came with a cost. Landowners, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of opposing the new order were arrested, exiled, or executed. The message was clear. The old Korea was gone, and a new one was rising, one built on collective labor, obedience, and ideological purity. In the cities, industries that had been developed by the Japanese were nationalized. Workers were promised equality, free education, and health care. Women were encouraged to take part in rebuilding the nation, and propaganda filled the streets with images of strength, unity, and devotion to the leader. Kim Il sung positioned himself as not merely a political figure, but a symbol of national rebirth, the man who had liberated the North from foreign domination. And with every speech, with every new policy, his cult of personality began to take shape. Meanwhile, south of the 38th parallel, an entirely different story was unfolding. The Republic of Korea was officially established in August 1948 under the presidency of Syngman Rhee. Rhee was a complex and controversial figure, educated in the United States, fluent in English, and deeply Christian. He had lived much of his life in exile, advocating for Korean independence in Washington and other foreign capitals. To the Americans, he appeared to be the perfect ally, anti-communist, Western-educated, and firmly opposed to Soviet influence. But Rhee was no simple puppet of the United States. He was fiercely nationalistic and deeply authoritarian. He believed that his destiny was to rule a unified Korea by any means necessary. His government, supported by U.S. military advisors, faced enormous challenges from the start. The South was devastated after decades of colonial exploitation. The economy was in ruins. Millions of refugees had fled from the North, creating overcrowded cities and widespread poverty. And politically, the region was divided among nationalists, communists, and moderates, all vying for power in a fragile, uncertain system. Rhee's administration moved swiftly to suppress opposition. Left-wing groups, labor unions, and farmers' associations were branded as communist sympathizers and crushed through arrests and violence. Thousands were imprisoned, and in some cases, executed without trial. The Americans, anxious to stabilize the region, largely turned a blind eye, prioritizing anti-communism over democracy. For them, Korea was part of a larger strategic game, one that had to be won at all costs. In both the North and the South, propaganda became a powerful weapon. In Pyongyang, radio broadcasts and newspapers told citizens that the South was a land of exploitation and corruption, ruled by American imperialists and their collaborators. In Seoul, state media painted the North as a prison of tyranny and deception, where citizens were enslaved under Soviet control. The people of Korea, who only a few years earlier had shared meals, marriages, and family bonds across regions, were now being taught to fear and despise each other. Still, beneath the political rhetoric, both Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee shared something profound, an unwavering belief that they alone were destined to reunify Korea under their own system. For Kim, reunification meant extending socialism across the peninsula, liberating the South from what he saw as foreign occupation. For Rhee, it meant driving out communism and restoring Korea under a democratic, Western-aligned state, though his version of democracy was often closer to one-man rule. By 1949, both sides had built armies not only to defend themselves, but to prepare for war. The Soviet Union trained and equipped the Korean People's Army, KPA, providing tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The KPA was disciplined, well organized, and confident. In the South, the United States supplied weapons and training to the Republic of Korea Army, ROKA. Though they initially withheld heavy armor and air support, fearing Rhee might use them to invade the North on his own initiative. It was a tense and volatile balance, two forces both claiming legitimacy, both armed and ready, separated by a fragile line that no one truly respected. At the same time, ordinary Koreans continued to suffer. Families, divided by the border, could no longer send letters or visit relatives. Economic recovery was slow and uneven. In the countryside, farmers struggled to feed their families, while urban populations grew restless. The promises of independence that had once filled the air in 1945 now seemed hollow. Instead of freedom, the peninsula had inherited new masters, new ideologies, and a looming sense that conflict was inevitable. The wider world was watching too. In Washington, officials debated how far America should go in defending South Korea. Some saw it as vital to the fight against communism. Others saw it as a distant problem in an unfamiliar part of Asia. In Moscow, Stalin monitored the situation carefully, unwilling to provoke direct conflict with the United States, but intrigued by the idea of spreading influence further east. The tension was global, but the consequences would be most deeply felt by the people of Korea themselves. By the dawn of 1950, both Koreas stood like mirrors of each other, each claiming to be the true Korea, each preparing for a showdown that would decide the peninsula's fate. Kim Il-sung saw himself as the revolutionary unifier, ready to sweep south and finish what history had started. Syngman Rhee, meanwhile, saw himself as the guardian of liberty, prepared to crush communism and claim his rightful place as the savior of a free Korea. It was only a matter of time before one side made the first move. The stage was set, the world was holding its breath, and the border at the 38th parallel, quiet, tense, and bristling with guns, would soon erupt into one of the most devastating wars of the 20th century. By 1949, the world was no longer recovering from war. It was dividing into two rival camps, each armed with nuclear power, each certain that its vision for humanity was the right one. The Cold War, as history would later call it, was more than a rivalry between nations. It was a clash of ideologies, economies, and worldviews, and Korea, still fragile and divided, found itself caught directly in the crossfire. To understand why Korea became the first major flashpoint of the Cold War, we have to step back and see the world as it looked in those years. On one side stood the United States and its allies, determined to contain the spread of communism wherever it appeared. On the other stood the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, promoting a vision of global socialism, a world free from what it called Western imperialism and capitalist exploitation. Both sides believed they were fighting not just for power, but for the future of civilization itself. And that made compromise almost impossible. After the devastation of World War II, the United States had emerged as a global superpower, its industries booming, its military unmatched, and its atomic bomb serving as the ultimate deterrent. Across the Atlantic, Europe lay in ruins. To prevent economic collapse and political instability, the U.S. launched the Marshall Plan, pouring billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe. But to Stalin, this looked less like generosity and more like a strategy to buy influence, a capitalist empire disguised as aid. In response, the Soviet Union tightened its grip over Eastern Europe, creating a sphere of influence that stretched from East Germany to Bulgaria. Communist parties, often backed by Moscow, took control in country after country. Europe became a continent divided by ideology, the Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill famously described it. Meanwhile, in 1949, two monumental events sent shockwaves through Washington. The first came in August, when the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb. The monopoly America once held on nuclear weapons was gone. The second came just a few months later, when Mao Zedong's communist forces triumphed in China's civil war, driving Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists to Taiwan. The world's most populous nation had turned red. In the eyes of many Americans, these weren't isolated events. They were part of a single, ominous pattern. Communism, they believed, was spreading like wildfire. Korea, small and distant though it was, suddenly took on immense importance. It was the next domino in a line that, if left unchecked, might lead communism to engulf all of Asia. This was the atmosphere in which U.S. foreign policy hardened into a doctrine of containment. The idea was simple, but far-reaching. Wherever communism appeared to be expanding, the United States would step in to stop it, diplomatically, economically, militarily, whatever it took. The Korean Peninsula, sitting between the Soviet-backed North and the U.S.-supported South, became a perfect testing ground for this new strategy. In Moscow, Stalin viewed Korea not as a priority, but as a useful pawn in a much larger chess game. The Soviet Union was focused on rebuilding from the destruction of the war and consolidating its hold on Europe. But Stalin was cautious and calculating. He saw potential in using regional conflicts to expand influence without risking direct confrontation with the United States. For him, Kim Il sung's growing ambition to unify Korea by force presented both an opportunity and a risk. Kim, by this time, had grown increasingly impatient. He was convinced that the people of South Korea, weary of Syngman Rhee's authoritarian rule and economic hardship, would rise up in support of the North if war came. He believed a swift, decisive invasion could liberate the South in a matter of weeks, but he needed Stalin's approval and Soviet weapons to make it happen. Throughout 1949 and early 1950, Kim pressed his case repeatedly in meetings with Soviet officials. At first, Stalin refused. The United States, he argued, still had troops in the South, and a direct invasion could trigger a global war. But as events shifted, Stalin began to reconsider. When U.S. forces withdrew most of their troops from Korea in mid 1949, and when Washington left South Korea off its list of nations under direct American protection in early 1950, Stalin saw an opening. The geopolitical chessboard was changing quickly. The newly communist China, under Mao Zedong, was eager to assert itself as a revolutionary power and had strong ties to Kim's regime. The Soviets could now rely on China as a buffer and a potential partner in Asia. The balance of power had shifted, and Stalin sensed that the risk of war on the Korean Peninsula might now be worth taking, especially if it could test the resolve of the West. Meanwhile, in the United States, policymakers debated how to respond to this new era of confrontation. President Harry S. Truman, who had overseen the end of World War II and the beginning of the nuclear age, was grappling with the question of how to defend freedom without plunging the world into another catastrophic war. The National Security Council produced a landmark document, NSC 68, which argued that the U.S. must dramatically increase military spending and take a firm stand against communist expansion everywhere. In simple terms, the world was no longer safe. Every local conflict could become a spark in a global fire, and in the minds of both superpowers, Korea was one of those sparks. For ordinary Koreans, however, the ideological battle of the Cold War felt distant compared to the everyday struggles of survival. The North was rebuilding under strict Soviet guidance, with rapid industrialization and collective farming. The South, reliant on American aid, was struggling with political unrest, strikes, and poverty. Both sides accused each other of sabotage and infiltration. Along the 38th parallel, border skirmishes became increasingly common. Small firefights, ambushes, and raids that foreshadowed the larger war to come. Each side accused the other of provocation, but both were guilty. By early 1950, hundreds of such incidents had occurred, costing lives and fueling paranoia. Soldiers on either side of the line rarely slept peacefully. The border wasn't a wall, it was a powder keg. At the same time, propaganda intensified. In schools and newspapers, young Koreans were taught to view their northern or southern brothers not as family, but as enemies, traitors, collaborators, or imperialists. It was a tragedy that unfolded quietly in the minds of a generation who would soon be asked to fight and die for political ideals that few of them truly understood. By the spring of 1950, the pieces were all in place. Kim Il sung had secured Soviet approval for his plan, along with tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Stalin gave his blessing, but with one critical condition: If the United States intervened, North Korea would have to rely on China for support, not direct Soviet aid. In May, Kim met with Chinese leaders to confirm their cooperation. Mao agreed, though cautiously. The Chinese were still recovering from their own civil war and wary of overextending, but Mao understood the symbolic power of a united communist Korea on China's border. And so, under the tense shadow of the Cold War, with both superpowers watching and waiting, the final preparations for war began. Korea was no longer just a divided country. It was a front line in a global confrontation between East and West, between two visions of what the world should be. No one could have predicted that within weeks, this fragile peninsula would erupt into full-scale war, drawing nations from every corner of the world into a conflict that would leave millions dead and reshape the balance of power for generations to come. In the early hours of June 25th, 1950, as the first pale light crept over the mountains of the Korean Peninsula, a deep rumble rolled through the valleys north of the 38th parallel. To the few farmers awake at that hour, it might have sounded like distant thunder, but it wasn't the weather changing. It was history. Columns of North Korean tanks, Soviet-made T-34s, were on the move, engines growling, treads crushing the quiet roads that led south toward Seoul. Within hours, artillery shells rained down across the border. The Korean War had begun. The attack was not a border raid or a minor skirmish like those that had flared up over the previous year. It was a full-scale invasion, meticulously planned and coordinated. The Korean People's Army, KPA, launched its assault along nearly the entire front, backed by heavy artillery and airstrikes. In less than a day, the fragile peace that had existed since 1945 was gone. Kim Il-sung had spent months preparing for this moment. He believed he was carrying out a liberation, not a conquest. His advisors assured him that the South Korean people would welcome the North's advance as freedom from Syngman Rhee's harsh rule. Soviet military planners had helped draw up the operation, supplying tanks, trucks, and aircraft. The strategy was swift and simple. Overwhelm the Republic of Korea Army, ROKA, before the United States or the United Nations could react. At dawn, KPA infantry crossed the Inchon River under heavy fog. The roar of engines, the blast of shells, and the shouts of advancing troops echoed through the hills. By mid-morning, the first North Korean tanks smashed through thin South Korean defenses near Kaesong. Soldiers who had never before faced armor were scattered in panic. Communications broke down. Ammunition ran short. Many South Korean units simply dissolved, leaving their weapons behind. In Seoul, news of the invasion reached President Syngman Rhee just after breakfast. The reports were confused and fragmented, but one thing was clear. The North had struck hard. Rhee immediately appealed to the United States for help, framing the attack as proof that communism was on the march. He ordered the destruction of key bridges leading into the capital to slow the northern advance, even as tens of thousands of civilians tried to flee across them. For the people of Seoul, panic spread faster than any military order. Families grabbed what they could carry: bundles of rice, photographs, bedding, and poured into the streets. Rumors of atrocities swept through the crowd. By evening, smoke from burning fuel depots hung over the city like a shroud. The sound of artillery drew closer with each hour. Across the Pacific, in Washington, D.C., it was still June 24th When the first urgent cables arrived at the State Department, American diplomats in Korea reported that North Korean forces had launched a massive offensive. At the time, President Harry S. Truman was in his home state of Missouri. He was woken early the next morning with the news. A war had erupted in Asia. For months, U.S. intelligence analysts had debated whether Kim Il sung might attack, but few believed he would risk open war. Now the question was no longer if, but how to respond. Truman called an emergency meeting with his advisors at Blair House. Among those present were Secretary of State Dean Acheson and Defense Secretary Lewis Johnson. The mood was grim. The United States had pledged to contain communism. Yet here it was, on the march again. Within hours, Truman made a decision that would shape not only Korea's future, but decades of American foreign policy. He announced that the United States would support South Korea through the United Nations, framing the conflict as an act of international aggression. It was a clever diplomatic move. By working through the UN, the U.S. could act quickly while presenting the response as a collective defense of peace. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, ambassadors were roused from bed as urgent sessions convened through the night. The Soviet delegate, who could have vetoed any resolution, was boycotting the UN over a separate issue involving China's representation. That absence proved decisive. The UN Security Council voted to condemn North Korea's invasion and called on member nations to assist South Korea in repelling the attack. Within days, a coalition of nations, from Britain and Canada to Australia and Turkey, pledged forces under a unified command led by the United States. Back on the peninsula, the situation deteriorated rapidly. By June 28th, only 3 days after the invasion, Seoul fell. The South Korean army, poorly equipped and outnumbered, could not hold the city. As North Korean troops marched across the Han River, the last bridge was blown up behind retreating ROK soldiers. Tragically, while hundreds of civilians were still on it, the explosion sent bodies and debris tumbling into the river below. The sight of that bridge collapsing became one of the war's defining early images, a symbol of desperation and chaos. North Korean forces moved methodically southward, taking town after town. They captured rail lines, airfields, and supply depots, cutting off retreating units. Thousands of prisoners were taken. Many were executed as counter-revolutionaries. For the KPA, the early weeks were a triumph. Propaganda broadcasts boasted that Seoul had been liberated from the American puppets. Posters showed smiling farmers greeting northern soldiers with flowers, though in reality, fear often outweighed celebration. American troops began arriving in late June. The first contingents, drawn from U.S. occupation forces in Japan, were hastily assembled and underprepared. Their mission was simple: hold the line until reinforcements could arrive. The first engagement between U.S. and North Korean forces occurred near the town of Osan on July 5, 1950. It was a rude awakening. The lightly armed American task force, known as Task Force Smith, faced a column of T-34 tanks. Their bazookas and mortars failed to penetrate the armor. Within hours, they were overrun. The lesson was brutal. This would be no easy fight. As July dragged on, the war became a relentless retreat for the South and its allies. Temperatures soared in the summer heat. Refugees clogged every road heading south. Villages burned, bridges collapsed, and the countryside filled with the cries of displaced families. By the end of the month, North Korean troops had driven UN and South Korean forces into a small defensive perimeter around the port city of Pusan in the southeast corner of the peninsula. It looked as if the entire nation might fall within weeks, but in those desperate days, a new resolve began to form among the soldiers holding the line. Reinforcements and supplies poured in from across the Pacific. American warships took up positions offshore, bombarding advancing KPA columns. Air superiority began to shift as U.S. jets arrived, striking railways, convoys, and depots. What had started as a rout was hardening into a determined stand. Yet even as the front stabilized, the human cost grew unbearable. Korean villages were reduced to ashes. Families wandered among ruins, searching for loved ones. The roads were lined with ox carts, carrying the wounded and the dead. The war was less than a month old, and already the peninsula was drowning in blood. From Washington to Moscow, from Beijing to Tokyo, the world watched as this small corner of Asia became the center of global attention. The invasion of South Korea was no longer a local dispute. It was a test of wills between superpowers. The Cold War had burst into open flame, and for the people caught in its path, the soldiers digging foxholes at Pusan, the mothers clutching their children on the roads, the leaders signing orders from distant capitals, the realization was dawning that this would not be a short war, nor an easy one. The spark that ignited on June 25th would blaze for 3 long years, reshaping nations and generations to come. As the news of North Korea's invasion spread across the Pacific in late June 1950, the United States found itself facing a sudden, urgent dilemma. The Korean Peninsula, a small and relatively distant piece of land in East Asia, had erupted into full-scale war overnight. For American leaders, the attack was more than a regional conflict. It was a dramatic test of the containment policy that had been established to resist the spread of communism worldwide. President Harry S. Truman, who had already navigated the end of World War II, the atomic bomb, and the early tensions of the Cold War, was now confronted with another urgent decision. How should the United States respond to an unprovoked invasion by a communist state backed by the Soviet Union? How could they support South Korea without plunging the world into another global war? These questions were pressing, and the answers had far-reaching consequences. On June 25th, Truman convened a meeting of senior officials at the White House, including Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Omar Bradley. Reports were still coming in from the peninsula. Seoul was under threat, and South Korean forces were in disarray. The first recommendation from the Pentagon was cautious. Send limited military aid while assessing North Korea's intentions. Truman, however, understood that hesitation could be costly. The strategic concern was clear. If North Korea succeeded in overrunning the South, it would represent a major victory for communism, emboldening Moscow and Beijing while undermining U.S. credibility around the globe. Truman's advisors were deeply aware that the domino theory, which suggested that one nation falling to communism might trigger a cascade across neighboring countries, could soon be tested in Asia. Korea was now the first domino. The president made a decisive move. He ordered that the U.S. military intervene immediately, committing air, naval, and ground forces to assist South Korea. It was a rapid decision, reflecting both the urgency of the moment and Truman's commitment to containment. The U.S. would act under the banner of the United Nations, allowing for international legitimacy while also sending a clear message to the communist powers. Aggression against South Korea would not go unanswered. Within hours, American forces stationed in Japan were mobilized. These units, initially part of the post-World War II occupation forces, were rushed into action. Infantry, artillery, and logistical support were sent south, followed by naval and air assets. The goal was not to immediately launch a counteroffensive, but to stabilize the situation and prevent the total collapse of South Korean resistance. In addition to deploying troops, Truman turned to diplomacy. The United Nations Security Council, convened in New York, quickly passed Resolution 82, condemning North Korea's invasion as a violation of international peace. The resolution called on member nations to assist South Korea in repelling the attack, providing both legitimacy and moral weight to U.S. military action. Interestingly, the Soviet Union was absent from the vote, boycotting the UN in protest of China's seat being held by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. This absence allowed the resolution to pass with minimal opposition, a critical factor in the early international response. Meanwhile, U.S. military planners faced enormous logistical challenges. The rapid deployment required moving troops, equipment, and supplies thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean. Ports in Japan became hubs of frantic activity, with ships carrying tanks, artillery, and ammunition departing almost daily. Air transport units flew essential supplies directly into South Korean territory, often under the threat of North Korean air raids. It was a massive undertaking, and coordination was critical, given that the first American units arriving in Korea would likely face heavily armed and experienced enemy forces. The first U.S. ground units to arrive were part of Task Force Smith, a small regiment-sized element sent to hold the line near Osan, south of Seoul. Task Force Smith was not fully equipped for modern armored warfare. It had limited anti-tank weaponry and minimal artillery support. Their mission was to delay the North Korean advance and buy time for additional forces to arrive. In the first engagement, on July 5, 1950, the limitations of American preparation became painfully clear. The North Korean T-34 tanks, supported by infantry and artillery, overwhelmed the task force. Despite courage and determination, the Americans were forced to retreat. This encounter highlighted that the U.S. was entering a war it had not fully prepared for, and that the KPA was a disciplined and capable force. As North Korean troops continued their advance, American air and naval forces took on an increasingly critical role. Carrier-based aircraft from the Pacific struck at enemy columns, supply lines, and communication networks. B-29 bombers targeted key infrastructure in the north, aiming to disrupt reinforcements and logistics. Meanwhile, U.S. warships patrolled the coastline, providing artillery support for retreating South Korean forces and helping evacuate civilians and military personnel from forward positions. The situation in Seoul was especially dire. By June 28th, just 3 days after the invasion began, North Korean forces entered the city. Civilians fled in panic, seeking refuge in any available building or across the Han River. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed in the fighting. The fall of Seoul sent shockwaves through the U.S. administration and underscored the urgency of the military response. American forces could not afford delay or hesitation. President Truman also faced political pressures at home. Congress, still aware of the horrors of World War II, was wary of another prolonged conflict in Asia. Truman needed to justify the intervention not only as a defense of South Korea, but as a step to preserve global stability. His speeches emphasized the principle that aggression could not go unchallenged, framing the Korean conflict as a test of moral and political resolve. The first weeks of American involvement were therefore a combination of combat, coordination, and diplomacy. While soldiers fought to hold positions and protect civilians, diplomats worked to secure international support. Propaganda campaigns reinforced the narrative of defending freedom and resisting communist expansion. Media outlets covered the crisis extensively, conveying both the gravity and urgency of the conflict to the American public. One of the most important aspects of America's response was the recognition that this was a limited war at first, distinct from World War II. Truman and his advisors did not initially consider invading North Korea or using nuclear weapons. Instead, the focus was on stabilization, containment, and support for South Korea. This careful approach reflected the administration's awareness of the broader stakes. Any escalation could trigger a global confrontation with the Soviet Union. By mid-July, American forces were fully engaged in combat alongside South Korean units. The Pusan Perimeter, a small area in the southeast corner of the peninsula, became the focal point of the defense. Soldiers dug in under scorching summer heat, holding back wave after wave of North Korean attacks. It was here that the first real sense of American commitment crystallized. The United States would not abandon South Korea, even in the face of overwhelming odds. In retrospect, the U.S. response in these early weeks was critical to preventing a complete North Korean victory. Though poorly equipped and initially outmatched, American troops and logistics began to stabilize the front. The combination of air power, naval fire support, and reinforcements bought time, setting the stage for future counteroffensives that would eventually turn the tide of the war. In summary, America's entry into the Korean War was swift, decisive, and strategically calculated. It demonstrated the United States' willingness to defend its allies and maintain credibility in the early Cold War era. From Washington to the Korean Peninsula, from naval carriers to hastily deployed infantry, the U.S. response marked the beginning of a new phase in global geopolitics, one in which Korea would become a central battlefield in a worldwide struggle between competing ideologies. The war, which had begun as a rapid North Korean invasion, now escalated into a broader conflict with global implications, drawing the United States fully into the fight. The decisions made in these early weeks would resonate for decades, shaping American foreign policy, military strategy, and the very character of the Cold War itself. By the summer of 1950, the Korean War had escalated into a full-scale crisis. North Korean forces, highly trained, well-equipped, and aggressive, had overrun much of South Korea. Cities fell rapidly, infrastructure was destroyed, and millions of civilians were displaced in a desperate scramble to escape the advancing KPA. Amid this chaos, a small corner of the southeastern peninsula became the last refuge for South Korean and United Nations forces. This critical defensive position would become known as the Pusan Perimeter, a narrow stretch of land around the port city of Pusan that would hold the key to survival. The Pusan Perimeter was more than just a defensive line. It was a lifeline stretching roughly 140 miles across the southeastern tip of the peninsula. It encompassed a series of hills, rivers, and strategic roadways. The terrain was challenging. Rugged mountains, steep ridges, and narrow passes made large-scale troop movements difficult. Yet this same geography provided a natural advantage to the defenders, offering choke points and defensible positions where smaller forces could slow the advance of larger, mechanized North Korean units. In August 1950, the Pusan Perimeter was manned by a mix of South Korean troops and hastily deployed U.S. forces. These soldiers were undertrained, poorly equipped, and inexperienced in modern armored warfare, yet they were determined to hold the line. General Walker of the U.S. 8th Army coordinated the defense, understanding that the loss of the perimeter would likely mean the fall of South Korea itself. From the outset, the situation was desperate. Supplies were limited. Ammunition, food, and medical support struggled to keep pace. With the rapid influx of refugees and troops, roads clogged with refugees moving south created logistical nightmares, often slowing military movements. Soldiers faced the dual challenge of defending against a relentless enemy while also managing humanitarian crises along the front lines. North Korean forces attacked with intensity. They employed combined arms tactics, integrating tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support. The T-34 tanks, in particular, were a formidable challenge for U.S. and South Korean forces, many of whom lacked sufficient anti-tank weaponry. The KPA exploited every weakness in the perimeter, launching repeated assaults on hills, ridges, and key road junctions. Each battle was fierce, with heavy casualties on both sides. Despite the odds, the defenders held. They dug trenches, established fortified positions, and coordinated artillery and air support to repel enemy advances. The American Air Force, operating from nearby bases in Japan, became crucial. Fighter bombers and reconnaissance planes targeted North Korean supply lines, railroads, and troop concentrations, slowing the enemy's momentum and giving ground forces critical breathing room. One notable aspect of the Pusan defense was the integration of naval firepower. U.S. and Allied ships patrolled the coast, bombarding advancing KPA units and providing artillery support where terrain made land-based defense difficult. This combined use of sea, air, and land forces showcased a level of coordination that, despite limited resources, proved essential in preventing a collapse. Life on the Pusan perimeter was grueling. Soldiers endured scorching summer heat, poor sanitation, and constant threat of attack. Many lacked proper equipment and adequate rations, and morale fluctuated in response to casualties and the sheer scale of the conflict. Yet camaraderie and determination were pervasive. Commanders emphasized resilience, often reminding troops that holding the perimeter was not just a military necessity, but a symbol of hope for a nation under siege. For civilians trapped within or near the Pusan perimeter, survival required extraordinary endurance. Refugee camps were overcrowded, lacking sufficient food, water, and medical care. Disease and malnutrition were constant threats. Families huddled together in makeshift shelters, listening as artillery fire echoed over the mountains at night. In this environment, every day was a struggle, yet communities adapted, supporting each other, even amid chaos. The battles within the Pusan perimeter were numerous and intense. Key locations, such as the Naktong River line, became sites of repeated assaults. North Korean units attempted to cross rivers using rafts, boats, and improvised means, often under heavy fire. Defenders employed every available resource: machine guns, mortars, and artillery to stop the crossings. Even when lines were breached, rapid counterattacks pushed enemy units back, demonstrating a level of tactical flexibility and determination that surprised many observers. In addition to combat, the Pusan Perimeter was a testing ground for modern combined arms warfare. The integration of infantry, artillery, tanks, aircraft, and naval support illustrated a new form of military coordination. The use of close air support, rapid troop movement, and coordinated artillery barrages set patterns that would influence U.S. military operations in future conflicts. Lessons learned at Pusan would shape doctrine and planning for years to come. Morale within the perimeter was also shaped by international support. The United Nations' involvement, though symbolic at first, provided both legitimacy and practical assistance. Troops from countries like Britain, Australia, and the Philippines began to arrive, supplementing U.S. and South Korean forces. This coalition effort demonstrated that, despite initial unpreparedness, international coordination could create a formidable defense against aggression. As the summer of 1950 progressed, the Pusan Perimeter held against repeated North Korean offensives, defying expectations of many military analysts. The KPA, confident after their rapid advance south, was forced to regroup and reconsider their strategy. For the defenders, every successful repulsion of an attack boosted morale and provided crucial time to bring in reinforcements, supplies, and heavier weaponry. The Pusan Perimeter also became a stage for acts of extraordinary courage and heroism. Soldiers and civilians alike displayed remarkable resilience, often under impossible conditions. Stories of small units holding key hills, engineers repairing bridges under fire, and medics tending to the wounded in makeshift hospitals became part of the narrative of survival and resistance. While the KPA's ultimate goal was to capture all of South Korea, the Pusan Perimeter became the symbol of resistance and strategic endurance. Holding the line was not just a tactical necessity, it represented the determination of the United States, the United Nations, and South Korea to resist aggression and uphold the principle that nations could not be conquered unchallenged. In retrospect, the defense of the Pusan Perimeter marked a turning point in the early stages of the Korean War. Without this last-ditch effort, the North Korean advance might have swept the entire peninsula before U.S. and Allied forces could fully mobilize. By holding the perimeter, the defenders preserved the possibility of a counteroffensive that would later reshape the course of the war, including the daring Inchon landing that would ultimately shift momentum back in favor of the United Nations forces. The Pusan Perimeter was more than a military line. It was a test of endurance, coordination, and resolve. It showed that even against overwhelming odds, disciplined defense, strategic use of terrain, and international cooperation could prevent complete defeat. For soldiers on the front lines, for civilians struggling to survive, and for leaders coordinating from afar, the perimeter became a lifeline, a beacon of hope in one of the darkest moments of the Korean War. By August 1950, the situation on the Korean Peninsula had reached a critical juncture. The North Korean People's Army, KPA, had pushed South Korean and United Nations forces into a tight corner around the southeastern city of Pusan, threatening to overrun all organized resistance. The outlook was grim. Supplies were scarce. Morale was fragile, and the international community watched anxiously. Yet, amidst the tension and despair, a bold and audacious plan emerged. A plan that would change the course of the war. The Inchon landing, orchestrated by General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of United Nations forces in Korea. The strategic vision behind Inchon was simple, yet extraordinarily risky. The port city of Inchon lay on the western coast of Korea, near Seoul, the capital. By this time, North Korean forces had advanced far south, leaving their supply lines stretched thin. Capturing Inchon would allow UN forces to cut behind the enemy, severing their supply and communication lines, and enabling a rapid push to recapture Seoul. It was a classic amphibious assault. Strike where the enemy least expects it and change the dynamics of the battlefield. However, Inchon presented incredible challenges. The tides were extreme. In some areas, water levels could rise and fall more than 30 feet. The harbor was narrow and surrounded by mudflats, making the approach for landing craft extremely dangerous. There were limited beaches suitable for troops to land, and the city was heavily fortified. The operation required precise timing, meticulous planning, and absolute surprise, because failure could result in catastrophic losses. Despite these challenges, General MacArthur was determined. He believed that bold action, rather than cautious defense, was the only way to reverse the North Korean advance. MacArthur argued that Inchon would strike directly at the heart of the enemy's operations and demoralize the KPA, forcing them into disarray. Skeptics in the U.S. military feared it was a suicide mission. The risks were immense. One miscalculation in tide, navigation, or enemy resistance could destroy the landing force before it reached shore. Yet MacArthur's vision prevailed, and the operation was greenlit in early September 1950. Preparations for the assault were extensive. Naval vessels moved into position to bombard enemy positions along the coast. Intelligence units gathered detailed information about North Korean defenses, tides, and terrain. Amphibious units rehearsed landings on mock beaches in Japan, ensuring that every soldier and sailor understood their role. Coordination among air, sea, and ground forces was critical. It was a combined arms operation at its finest, requiring flawless timing. On September 15, 1950, the landing began. In the pre-dawn darkness, U.S. Marines and Army units approached the Inchon coast under cover of naval bombardment. Precision was everything. The first waves of troops disembarked on the narrow beaches, often wading through mud and debris, facing mines, barbed wire, and sporadic enemy fire. Despite the dangerous conditions, the assault caught the North Korean forces completely off guard. They had not anticipated an attack in this area. They were focused on the advancing UN and South Korean troops at the Pusan Perimeter. The success of Inchon was immediate and dramatic. UN forces quickly established a beachhead and began advancing inland. North Korean units, disoriented by the sudden strike, struggled to mount effective resistance. By September 19th, just 4 days after the landing, UN forces had broken through to the outskirts of Seoul. The recapture of Seoul itself was a monumental challenge. The city had been under North Korean control for over 3 months, and the KPA had fortified key positions. Street to street and building to building fighting ensued. UN troops faced sniper fire, artillery, and improvised defenses. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, fled whenever possible, though many were trapped in the destruction. Despite these difficulties, the combination of superior firepower, tactical coordination, and the element of surprise enabled UN forces to retake the city by September 28, 1950. The psychological impact of the Inchon landing cannot be overstated. North Korean forces, which had seemed unstoppable just weeks before, were suddenly forced into a rapid and chaotic retreat. Soldiers who had been advancing confidently southward were now fleeing north to defend their territory. Morale among UN and South Korean troops soared. The operation demonstrated the power of initiative, surprise, and careful planning, principles that would become case studies in military academies around the world. Logistically, Inchon allowed UN forces to cut the KPA's supply lines, isolating units deep in the south. Trucks, ammunition, and reinforcements could no longer move freely, and the retreating North Korean army faced shortages of food, fuel, and weapons. This disruption enabled UN forces to transition from defensive operations around Pusan to offensive operations that pushed northward, reversing months of losses in just weeks. The landing also had a symbolic dimension. Retaking Seoul sent a powerful message to both Koreans and the international community. North Korean aggression could be countered and reversed. For civilians, it restored hope that the occupation would not last indefinitely. For South Korean leadership, it validated the strategy of working with international partners to reclaim their homeland. From a strategic perspective, the Incheon landing showcased the value of joint operations. Coordinating naval gunfire, air strikes, and ground assaults across challenging terrain required meticulous planning and communication. The success relied not just on bold leadership, but on the professionalism and bravery of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and pilots who executed the plan with precision. However, the operation was not without cost. Casualties among UN forces were significant, though far fewer than anticipated. The urban combat in Seoul resulted in destruction and civilian suffering. Yet when measured against the alternative, a continued North Korean advance and potential collapse of the Pusan Perimeter, the benefits were enormous. By the end of September 1950, the Korean War had shifted dramatically. From a defensive posture at Pusan, UN and South Korean forces were now pursuing the retreating North Korean army toward the 38th parallel, signaling the beginning of a new phase of the conflict. The miracle at Inchon had lived up to its name. Against all odds, an audacious plan executed with precision had turned the tide of the war. Inchon became a defining moment in military history. It demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming danger, bold strategy, meticulous planning, and international cooperation could overcome formidable challenges. The operation would be remembered not only for its tactical brilliance, but for the courage and perseverance of all those who fought, planned, and endured to make it a success. The recapture of Seoul and the disruption of North Korean supply lines set the stage for the next critical chapter of the Korean War. The UN advance into North Korea and the eventual intervention of Chinese forces, Inchon was more than a military maneuver. It was a turning point that shifted momentum, redefined possibilities, and reshaped the Korean Peninsula's destiny. With the success of the Inchon landing and the recapture of Seoul in late September 1950, the Korean War entered a dramatic new phase. United Nations forces, bolstered by the audacity of MacArthur's plan, were no longer on the defensive at Pusan. Instead, they found themselves poised to pursue the retreating North Korean People's Army, KPA, across the peninsula, shifting from survival to a full-scale offensive aimed at restoring control over South Korea and potentially more. The momentum was clear. North Korean forces, previously advancing with near unchecked speed, were now disorganized and overextended. Supply lines had been severed by the rapid amphibious assault at Inchon, forcing the KPA to retreat under harsh conditions. UN forces, including South Korean, American, and Allied contingents from Britain, Australia, and the Philippines, were prepared to capitalize on this vulnerability. Roads once clogged with refugees now became arteries for reinforcements, artillery, and mechanized units. The UN strategy was straightforward but ambitious. Pursue the KPA northward, liberate remaining territory in South Korea, and secure positions along the 38th parallel, the pre-war dividing line. This approach was both tactical and symbolic. Tactical, because eliminating KPA units from southern Korea would prevent a renewed invasion. Symbolic, because it signaled to the Korean people and the world that the UN was committed to resisting aggression and restoring sovereignty. As UN forces advanced, the challenges of the Korean terrain became evident. The peninsula's mountainous landscape, combined with limited infrastructure, slowed movement and complicated logistics. Troop convoys had to navigate narrow roads. Bridges were damaged or destroyed, and the weather began to shift from hot summer to rainy autumn conditions. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair roads and railways, often under enemy artillery fire. Air reconnaissance became essential to identify enemy positions, track retreats, and coordinate artillery strikes. Despite these challenges, the advance progressed quickly. UN forces recaptured Inchon's surrounding areas, clearing remaining KPA resistance pockets, and systematically moved northward toward Seoul. Urban combat remained intense in some areas. Even after the initial liberation, North Korean units frequently mounted defensive operations in towns, employing ambushes, fortified buildings, and snipers to slow the UN advance. Soldiers were constantly alert, aware that the KPA, though retreating, remained dangerous and unpredictable. One of the most critical elements of the UN push north was the integration of air power. UN aircraft, operating from bases in South Korea and Japan, targeted retreating columns, supply depots, and artillery positions. Fighter bombers disrupted enemy movements, while bombers struck strategic rail lines, effectively cutting off reinforcements from the north. This coordination of air and ground operations exemplified modern combined arms warfare and provided a decisive advantage against a retreating but still dangerous enemy. The psychological impact of the UN advance was profound. North Korean troops, once confident and aggressive, were now demoralized. Units that had previously moved in coordinated offensives found themselves scattered, suffering from shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Desertions increased and morale plummeted. For the South Korean population, the advance was a sign of liberation and relief. Towns were freed from occupation, and survivors of the KPA's earlier terror could begin rebuilding, at least temporarily, as UN forces pushed northward. The 38th parallel loomed. This line, originally drawn in 1945 as a temporary division for administrative purposes, now held enormous strategic significance for General MacArthur and his planners. Crossing the 38th parallel was more than a military decision. It was a statement of principle. To some, it represented the opportunity to finish what North Korean aggression had begun, to unify Korea under a non-communist government. To others, it carried enormous risk, as crossing into North Korea could provoke intervention from China or the Soviet Union. The advance toward the 38th parallel also highlighted the differences in UN and South Korean objectives. While MacArthur and the United States were focused on military success and the potential reunification of Korea under anti-communist leadership, South Korean forces under President Syngman Rhee were motivated by nationalistic and political goals. Rhee openly advocated for pushing beyond the 38th parallel to achieve full unification under his government, even if it risked international complications. This divergence in objectives would later create tension within the coalition and influence key strategic decisions. Despite these complexities, the UN push north continued effectively through October 1950. North Korean forces were increasingly unable to mount organized defenses. Key cities and transportation hubs fell, and the retreat became a rout in many sectors. Casualties were still high on both sides, but the pace of victory emboldened UN forces and reinforced the perception that the war could be decisively won in Korea. Yet the advance was not without warnings and risks. Intelligence reports began to note large troop movements across the Yalu River from China into North Korea. While initially underestimated, these signs indicated that China was preparing to intervene if UN forces moved too far north. The rugged terrain of northern Korea, combined with the potential arrival of fresh Chinese forces, presented a new set of challenges that MacArthur and the UN command had to consider carefully. During this period, the UN push also emphasized humanitarian and reconstruction efforts in liberated areas. Civilians returning to towns found cities damaged by occupation and warfare. UN forces often coordinated with local officials to restore order, provide food, and protect populations from remaining KPA elements. These efforts, though secondary to military objectives, were crucial in maintaining support for the UN operation and stabilizing liberated regions. The success of the push north demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated strategy, international cooperation, and decisive leadership. It showed that even after months of retreat and desperate defense, disciplined forces with clear objectives could regain initiative, inflict heavy losses on the enemy, and reshape the strategic landscape. By late October 1950, UN and South Korean forces had not only stabilized the peninsula south of the 38th parallel, but were now advancing into North Korean territory. The rapid shift from defensive operations at Pusan to aggressive offensive maneuvers in the north represented one of the most dramatic turnarounds in modern military history. However, the success of the UN advance also set the stage for the next critical phase of the war, The intervention of Chinese forces, the push north, while strategically brilliant, carried the risk of provoking a new and far more dangerous adversary. Intelligence and warnings had suggested that China viewed UN forces crossing the Yalu River as a direct threat to its borders. As the UN pursued North Korean forces further north, the Korean War was about to expand from a regional conflict into a broader, multinational struggle, one that would challenge the UN coalition and test the limits of military strategy in unprecedented ways. The UN pushed north, fueled by the momentum of Inchon and the determination of Allied forces, remains a defining moment in the Korean War. It demonstrated how bold, coordinated operations could reverse the fortunes of a conflict, turning a desperate defense into a decisive offensive. Yet, it also highlighted the perils of overextension, the complexities of coalition warfare, and the unpredictable dynamics of geopolitics in a Cold War era. In hindsight, the UN push north was a double-edged sword, a brilliant military maneuver that liberated South Korea, set the stage for reunification ambitions, and showcased the capabilities of modern combined arms operations, but also one that triggered the next, more dangerous chapter of the Korean War, Chinese intervention, which would dramatically reshape the conflict and extend its human and political costs. By late October 1950, the Korean War had taken a dramatic turn following the stunning success of the Inchon landing and the relentless UN push north. Forces under General Douglas MacArthur had advanced deep into North Korea, capturing key cities and pushing toward the Yalu River, the natural border between North Korea and China. What had begun as a desperate defense at the Pusan Perimeter was now a near total reversal. UN forces were advancing victoriously, seemingly on the verge of ending the war. Yet this rapid advance carried a hidden danger, one that would soon reshape the entire conflict. China, under Mao Zedong, had been closely monitoring the situation. Initially, Chinese leaders had been cautious, preoccupied with consolidating control over their vast nation following the recent civil war. Yet, the advance of foreign forces to the Yalu River, only a few dozen miles from Chinese territory, was perceived as a direct threat to national security. Mao and his generals feared that a UN-dominated North Korea could serve as a launchpad for American or UN forces into Manchuria, the resource-rich northeast of China. The prospect of hostile foreign troops on China's border was intolerable. Communicating this concern to North Korea and the Soviet Union, Mao argued for direct intervention. Initially, there was debate within Chinese leadership. Entering the war carried enormous risks. The People's Liberation Army, PLA, had just emerged from years of brutal civil war, infrastructure was fragile, and logistics were limited. Yet Mao believed that decisive action could prevent a repeat of what happened to Korea if left unchecked. By mid-October, Chinese leaders had resolved to intervene, preparing what would become a massive and clandestine military operation known as the People's Volunteer Army, PVA. The secrecy of Chinese intervention was critical. Chinese forces crossed into North Korea at night, often under extreme conditions. Troops moved in the freezing mountains and along difficult river crossings, avoiding detection by UN reconnaissance and air patrols. Equipment was limited. Many soldiers carried rifles, bayonets, and minimal artillery, yet the Chinese relied on speed, surprise, and sheer numbers. The objective was clear: blunt the UN advance, push forces south of the 38th parallel, and protect China's strategic interests. On October 19th, 1950, UN forces reached the Yalu River, encountering minimal resistance from retreating North Korean units. Confidence was high. MacArthur, buoyed by previous victories, publicly suggested that the war was nearing a conclusion and hinted at the possibility of unifying Korea under non-communist leadership. Reports of a final victory circulated in U.S. media, yet behind the scenes, intelligence of Chinese troop movements was growing, though many underestimated the scale and determination of the impending intervention. The first engagements between Chinese and UN forces occurred in late October and early November, but these initial clashes were sporadic and often underestimated. The Chinese avoided full-scale confrontation at first, focusing instead on harassing UN supply lines and infiltrating isolated units. Their tactics were unconventional. They used nighttime attacks, camouflage, and infiltration to exploit gaps in UN positions. Soldiers often appeared out of nowhere, striking quickly and then melting back into terrain that UN forces were ill prepared to dominate. By November 25th, 1950, the scale of Chinese intervention became undeniable. Chinese forces launched a massive offensive near the Chosin Reservoir and in the area of Unsan, where American and South Korean units were operating. The PVA used overwhelming numbers, attacking in multiple waves, often at night, leveraging surprise and terrain knowledge. Despite inferior equipment, the Chinese inflicted heavy casualties and forced a rapid UN retreat in several sectors. The North Korean army, now reinforced and reorganized with Chinese support, became a formidable force once more. The entry of Chinese forces marked a pivotal turning point in the war. Until this moment, the conflict had been largely defined by North Korean aggression and UN responses. With China's intervention, the war escalated into a broader international conflict, creating the first major proxy confrontation of the Cold War era. The balance of power had shifted. UN forces, which had been advancing rapidly, were now forced to reconsider strategy, consolidate positions, and adapt to a new, elusive, and highly motivated enemy. The logistical challenges faced by Chinese forces were staggering, yet they overcame them through ingenuity and determination. Soldiers marched hundreds of miles, often in freezing temperatures and rugged terrain, carrying their own supplies. Units established supply chains using bicycles, pack animals, and human porters, enabling them to maintain operational tempo despite harsh conditions. This combination of endurance, mobility, and discipline allowed Chinese forces to strike UN units before they could reorganize or fortify their positions. For UN commanders, the Chinese intervention was both shocking and deeply concerning. MacArthur, who had consistently advocated for bold action, now faced a strategic dilemma. Chinese forces were numerous, highly motivated, and willing to accept heavy casualties, characteristics that complicated UN planning. Intelligence reports initially underestimated Chinese strength, leading to overconfidence in the continuation of the northward advance. The disparity between UN expectations and reality would soon result in costly engagements. The first large-scale battle between UN and Chinese forces occurred at the Chosin Reservoir, where American Marines and Army units faced encirclement by numerically superior Chinese forces. Despite extreme cold, mountainous terrain, and relentless attacks, UN troops fought tenaciously, demonstrating tactical skill and discipline. However, the overall effect of Chinese intervention was undeniable. UN momentum had been halted, the front lines were destabilized, and the conflict had entered a prolonged and unpredictable phase. The psychological impact on UN and South Korean troops was profound. Soldiers who had celebrated victories at Inchon and during the push north now faced an enemy that seemed limitless, hidden, and relentless. Morale wavered as units confronted overwhelming numbers, night attacks, and brutal winter conditions. Commanders had to adapt quickly, emphasizing defensive tactics, flexible response, and coordination among multinational forces. Strategically, the Chinese intervention highlighted several critical realities of the Korean War. First, the conflict was no longer a localized struggle. It had become a proxy war within the larger Cold War context, pitting Western and Communist powers against each other indirectly. Second, terrain, weather, and unconventional tactics could neutralize technological advantages, forcing both sides to innovate. Third, the human dimension, endurance, morale, and willingness to accept casualties played a decisive role in shaping battlefield outcomes. By December 1950, the full scale of Chinese involvement was clear. UN forces were being pushed back southward, reversing many of the gains made during the Inchon landing and subsequent northward advance. The 38th parallel, once seen as a goal for UN operations, was now the site of intense and deadly combat as Chinese and North Korean forces sought to reclaim territory and inflict maximum losses. Chinese intervention fundamentally reshaped the Korean War, transforming it from a regional conflict into a complex, multinational struggle with global implications. It underscored the dangers of overextension, the unpredictability of international actors, and the high human cost of war. The momentum that UN forces had achieved in the fall of 1950 was halted, setting the stage for a grueling winter of combat, attrition, and strategic recalibration. Ultimately, the entry of China into the war revealed that the Korean conflict was far from over. What had begun as a UN counteroffensive to repel North Korean aggression had evolved into a broader struggle between communist and non-communist powers, with the Korean Peninsula at the epicenter. The stage was set for a prolonged, bloody, and unpredictable conflict, one that would challenge the limits of military strategy, international cooperation, and human endurance. By late November 1950, the Korean War had entered one of its most grueling and iconic phases. The rapid advance of United Nations forces into North Korea had been abruptly checked by the entry of Chinese forces, and now American and Allied troops faced the brutal reality of winter combat against an enemy willing to endure extreme conditions. Among these engagements, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir stands out as a defining moment, showcasing extraordinary endurance, tactical skill, and the human cost of war. The Chosin Reservoir, located in the mountainous northeast of North Korea, near the border with China, was a remote and strategically important area. The surrounding terrain was rugged, with steep hills, narrow passes, and dense forests. Temperatures during late November and December often dropped below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, creating hazardous conditions for soldiers unaccustomed to such extreme cold. Despite its challenges, control of the reservoir was vital for UN operations, serving as a staging area for the continued push toward the Yalu River and the consolidation of territory in northern Korea. UN forces in the region consisted primarily of U.S. Marines, supported by elements of the Army and Allied units. The troops had advanced rapidly northward, sometimes stretching supply lines thin. Intelligence reports warned of the presence of large Chinese formations, but the scale and intensity of the impending engagement were not fully appreciated. Many commanders underestimated the ability of the People's Volunteer Army, PVA, to operate effectively in such harsh winter conditions and challenging terrain. The Chinese plan was meticulously designed to exploit the terrain and the element of surprise. PVA forces, numbering over 120,000 troops in multiple divisions, moved covertly through mountain passes, often at night, to encircle UN positions. They relied on mobility, knowledge of the terrain, and coordinated attacks in waves to overwhelm individual units. Despite being lightly armed relative to the UN, they utilized numerical superiority and guerrilla-style tactics to exploit weaknesses in the UN defensive perimeter. On November 27, 1950, the battle commenced. UN troops, centered around the 1st Marine Division, under Major General Edward Almond, were quickly surrounded in and around the reservoir. The Chinese launched relentless attacks from all directions, often during the night, exploiting gaps in the UN lines and attempting to cut off retreat routes. Soldiers faced constant threat of ambush, artillery fire, and infiltration behind their positions. Communication lines were strained, and coordination among units became a critical factor in survival. The conditions at Chosin added an unprecedented level of difficulty. Freezing temperatures caused weapons to malfunction, vehicles to stall, and medical conditions, such as frostbite, to become severe. Soldiers were forced to fight not only the enemy, but also the environment itself. Tents, clothing, and rations were insufficient for the extreme cold, and hypothermia became a constant threat. Yet despite these challenges, discipline, training, and leadership enabled UN forces to maintain cohesion under extraordinary pressure. Artillery and air support played a crucial role in sustaining the defenders. UN artillery units provided covering fire against massed Chinese assaults, while aircraft strafed and bombed enemy concentrations. However, the extreme cold and mountainous terrain limited the effectiveness of some air operations, forcing ground units to engage directly with overwhelming enemy forces. Coordination among infantry, artillery, and air units was essential to prevent units from being overrun. One of the defining aspects of the battle was the organization and leadership displayed by UN commanders. Despite being surrounded, cut off from resupply, and facing a determined enemy, leaders such as Colonel Chesty Puller and Major General Almond maintained morale, directed counterattacks, and orchestrated strategic withdrawals. The ability to hold positions, delay the enemy, and eventually execute a fighting retreat demonstrated exceptional tactical skill under adverse conditions. The fighting was intense, with Chinese forces frequently attacking in waves. Soldiers reported seeing units advancing shoulder to shoulder in the freezing night, often singing or shouting to maintain coordination and morale. The Chinese relied heavily on human wave tactics, accepting high casualties to achieve local objectives. Despite superior firepower, UN troops faced moments where sheer numbers threatened to overwhelm positions, creating chaos and testing discipline to its limits. A critical factor in the battle was logistics. Resupply by air was attempted, but severe weather, enemy interference, and terrain constraints limited effectiveness. Troops often had to conserve ammunition and ration supplies, improvising solutions to survive. Medical evacuation was extremely difficult. Injured soldiers were often exposed to freezing conditions for extended periods before they could be moved. These challenges added to the physical and psychological strain of combat. Despite the encirclement, UN forces executed a strategic withdrawal from the Chosin Reservoir beginning in early December. The retreat, conducted over hundreds of miles in freezing temperatures, became a legendary feat of endurance and tactical skill. Troops maintained organized formations while fighting off repeated Chinese attacks, using rearguard actions, artillery support, and close quarters combat to prevent collapse. The withdrawal preserved the core of the fighting force, allowing many units to regroup and continue operations further south. The human cost of the battle was staggering. Thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed, wounded, or affected by frostbite. Equipment and vehicles were abandoned or destroyed to prevent capture. Civilians in the surrounding areas were caught in the crossfire, further compounding the tragedy. Yet, the resilience and courage displayed by UN troops became emblematic of the determination to resist overwhelming odds. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir had profound strategic implications. While UN forces were forced to withdraw, the battle delayed Chinese advances and inflicted heavy casualties on PVA units. The experience highlighted the dangers of underestimating an enemy, the importance of logistics and terrain in planning operations, and the extreme demands of winter warfare. The engagement demonstrated that even a numerically superior enemy could be checked and slowed by disciplined, well-coordinated forces. The battle also had a lasting impact on military doctrine. The lessons of Chosin Reservoir, including the integration of air, artillery, and infantry in difficult terrain, the management of supply under extreme conditions, and the execution of fighting withdrawals, have been studied extensively in military academies around the world. It underscored the importance of leadership, morale, and adaptability in modern warfare, and provided a stark reminder that human endurance often shapes outcomes as much as technology and numbers. In conclusion, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir was more than a military engagement. It was a crucible of courage, endurance, and tactical ingenuity. It showcased the ferocity of the Chinese intervention, the resilience of UN forces, and the extreme conditions under which the Korean War was fought. The battle's legacy lives on as a testament to the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds, shaping the course of the Korean War and leaving an indelible mark on military history. By early 1951, after months of brutal fighting, the Korean War had entered a prolonged and grueling stalemate. Following the Chinese intervention and the fierce battles, such as the Chosin Reservoir campaign, the front lines had stabilized near the 38th parallel, the pre-war dividing line between North and South Korea. Unlike the earlier dynamic phases of the war, rapid North Korean advances and audacious UN offensives, this period was characterized by entrenched positions, limited mobility, and attritional warfare. What emerged was a grueling form of combat reminiscent of the First World War. Trench warfare on the Korean Peninsula. The stalemate was partly the result of geopolitical considerations. Both sides recognized the potential consequences of full-scale breakthroughs for the United Nations, primarily led by the United States. Advancing too far into North Korea risked provoking the Soviet Union into direct involvement and escalating the war into a wider conflict. Similarly, Chinese and North Korean forces understood that aggressive offensives could overextend their supply lines, leaving them vulnerable to counterattack. As a result, both sides dug in, consolidating defensive positions and fortifying key terrain. The nature of combat during this phase reflected a highly static and attritional environment. Soldiers spent months in fortified positions along ridges, hills, and river banks, often within a few kilometers of the opposing lines. Frontline units rotated in and out, while artillery, machine guns, and mortars dominated the battlefield. Nighttime raids and patrols remained common, but large-scale advances became rare. The war had become a grueling contest of endurance, logistics, and preparation. Trench systems became elaborate and extensive. Both sides dug defensive networks that included dugouts, foxholes, and fortified bunkers. These positions provided protection from artillery and small arms fire while allowing troops to maintain observation over enemy movements. Barbed wire, mines, and other obstacles were used to slow potential attacks. Some trenches were connected by underground tunnels, providing protected routes for reinforcements, resupply, and medical evacuation. The engineering effort required to maintain these positions was substantial, particularly in mountainous or rocky terrain, where digging was physically demanding and slow. Life in the trenches was harsh and relentless. Soldiers faced extreme weather conditions, from blistering summer heat to freezing winter temperatures. Exposure to the elements led to frostbite, hypothermia, heat exhaustion, and disease. Sanitation was a constant challenge. Latrines were rudimentary, and contaminated water often led to outbreaks of dysentery and other illnesses. Food was supplied by increasingly sophisticated logistics networks, but shortages and rationing were common, particularly in remote or heavily shelled sectors. Psychological strain was equally severe. Soldiers were exposed to constant artillery bombardment, sniper fire, and the ever-present threat of enemy raids. Morale fluctuated, influenced by the monotony of defensive duty, the loss of comrades, and uncertainty about the broader strategic situation. Rotations, rest periods, and recreational activities were used where possible to maintain resilience. But the mental toll of trench warfare was undeniable. Letters home, news from the front, and camaraderie among troops became crucial for sustaining morale. Artillery emerged as the dominant weapon during this phase of the war. Both sides relied on heavy bombardments to weaken enemy positions, disrupt supply lines, and demoralize troops. Counter-battery fire became a common tactic, with opposing artillery units attempting to locate and destroy each other's batteries. A single day could see thousands of shells fired along narrow stretches of the front, turning hills and valleys into scarred and cratered landscapes. The destructive power of artillery often overshadowed small arms engagements, and survival depended on effective fortifications and quick reactions. Trench warfare also emphasized tactical innovation within a constrained environment. Patrols and reconnaissance became critical for gathering intelligence on enemy positions, fortifications, and movements. Night raids were conducted to destroy enemy emplacements, capture prisoners, or test defenses. Engineers constructed observation posts, listening devices, and camouflage networks to monitor activity while minimizing exposure. Even small gains in territory, such as capturing a hill or ridge, required careful planning, coordination, and often significant human cost. Supply and logistics became central to sustaining trench lines. Roads and railways were repaired and maintained under fire, while airdrops provided critical ammunition, medical supplies, and food to forward positions. Medics and stretcher bearers worked tirelessly to evacuate the wounded, often under enemy observation and bombardment. Winter conditions added additional complexity, freezing roads and rivers and slowing movement of both personnel and material. The static nature of the conflict did not mean it was without large-scale engagements. Occasionally, either side would attempt limited offensives to capture key terrain, disrupt enemy logistics, or test vulnerabilities. Battles such as Heartbreak Ridge and Punch Bowl exemplified the difficulty of offensive operations in this phase. Entrenched positions, combined with terrain and defensive firepower, made progress slow and costly. Infantry assaults were met with machine gun fire, mines, and artillery, often resulting in high casualties for minimal territorial gain. The stalemate also highlighted the importance of air power and naval support. UN aircraft conducted reconnaissance, close air support, and interdiction of supply lines, while naval units along the coast provided artillery bombardments and logistical assistance. Both sides sought to exploit every advantage offered by technology, intelligence, and terrain. However, the mountainous geography of central Korea limited the effectiveness of mechanized units and armored vehicles, reinforcing the primacy of infantry and artillery in this phase. Despite the intensity of the fighting, trench warfare allowed for a degree of predictability and control over the front. Both sides learned to anticipate enemy movements, rotate units, and maintain supply lines. Medical support and casualty management became more systematic, with field hospitals, casualty clearing stations, and evacuation routes improving survival rates. Coordination between infantry, artillery, engineers, and air units became increasingly sophisticated, reflecting the adaptation of military strategy to a static, attritional environment. The stalemate and trench warfare phase of the Korean War also had profound political implications. Negotiations for an armistice began in 1951, reflecting the recognition that military victory for either side was increasingly unlikely. The war's prolonged nature put pressure on governments, particularly in the United States, to manage domestic opinion and international strategy. At the same time, both China and North Korea faced the challenge of sustaining their forces and civilian populations under continued attritional conflict. In conclusion, the stalemate and trench warfare period marked a shift in the Korean War from rapid maneuver and dramatic offensives to grinding, attritional conflict. It tested the endurance, discipline, and ingenuity of soldiers on both sides. The terrain, climate, and tactical realities of entrenched combat created a uniquely challenging environment that shaped the subsequent course of the war. While less dramatic than the Inchon landing or the Chosin Reservoir battle, this period was critical for understanding the human cost, strategic complexity, and enduring legacy of the Korean War. By mid 1951, the Korean War had entered a phase of stalemate, with front lines stabilized near the 38th parallel and trench warfare dominating the battlefield. After months of intense fighting, both sides were exhausted, casualties were mounting, supplies were strained, and the political costs of continued combat were growing. Amid this grim reality, attention began to turn toward diplomacy, the search for an armistice that could halt the fighting without necessarily resolving all political disputes. The idea of negotiating a ceasefire emerged gradually. Both the United Nations, led by the United States, and the Communist Coalition of North Korea and China recognized that military victory was unlikely. The human, economic, and logistical toll of sustained warfare was unsustainable. For the UN, continuing the offensive posed risks of provoking the Soviet Union or further destabilizing East Asia. For North Korea and China, protracted conflict strained resources and threatened domestic stability. Thus, despite fierce ideological rivalry, pragmatism dictated exploring negotiations. Formal armistice talks began in July 1951 at Kaesong, a city near the border between North and South Korea. The initial discussions were marked by tension, mistrust, and delays. The communist delegation, led by North Korea and supported by China, and the United Nations Command, led by the United States, faced immediate hurdles. One of the first major points of contention was the issue of prisoners of war, POWs, which would dominate negotiations for months. The communist side insisted on voluntary repatriation, while the UN demanded the right for POWs to refuse repatriation if they so chose. Negotiations were further complicated by language barriers, cultural differences, and propaganda pressures. Every statement and concession was scrutinized by domestic and international audiences. The UN delegation, led by American generals and diplomats, had to balance military realities with political messaging, ensuring that any agreement would not undermine credibility or morale. Similarly, North Korean and Chinese negotiators had to maintain the appearance of strength while managing internal and external expectations. The pace of negotiations was slow. Initial talks often ended in stalemate, with little progress beyond procedural agreements. Both sides engaged in tactical maneuvering, using delays to consolidate positions on the battlefield or prepare for renewed offensives. Despite this, the existence of negotiations helped to reduce the intensity of some frontline fighting, creating localized pauses as commanders anticipated potential ceasefire arrangements. A critical breakthrough came with the recognition that the war had become a war of attrition. Neither side could realistically achieve decisive victory, and both faced mounting pressure from civilians, governments, and international allies to explore peace. The UN, for instance, was dealing with rising casualties and the growing cost of maintaining multinational forces in Korea. Public opinion in the United States and allied countries increasingly questioned the rationale for continuing a war with no clear end in sight. The negotiation process itself was complex and highly structured. Meetings alternated between delegation plenaries and working groups focused on specific issues, such as the location of the demilitarized zone, DMZ, armistice enforcement mechanisms, and the treatment of POWs. Delegates had to contend with not only military and political concerns, but also propaganda considerations. Each side sought to present strength, competence, and legitimacy, knowing that domestic and international observers would interpret concessions or delays as signs of weakness. One of the most contentious topics was the handling of prisoners of war. Approximately 100,000 UN soldiers and tens of thousands of North Korean and Chinese troops had been captured during the first year of the war. The communist side advocated for forced repatriation, while the UN insisted on voluntary return. This debate prolonged the negotiations for months, with both sides using propaganda and diplomatic pressure to sway public and international opinion. The issue was emotionally charged, as it involved the fates of tens of thousands of men, many of whom had endured severe hardship in captivity. Despite these challenges, progress was gradually made. Both sides began to agree on the concept of a demilitarized zone, DMZ, a buffer area along the 38th parallel, where military forces would be prohibited. The DMZ would serve as a formal boundary to prevent renewed hostilities and provide a foundation for monitoring compliance. The agreement to establish a DMZ represented a significant step forward, signaling that both sides were willing to accept a frozen battlefield as the basis for peace. Armistice talks also addressed the mechanisms for enforcing the ceasefire. Proposals included neutral inspection teams, joint commissions to investigate violations, and systems for reporting and resolving disputes. These mechanisms were intended to maintain stability, prevent misunderstandings, and ensure that both sides adhered to the terms of the armistice. While technical and bureaucratic, these discussions were critical to the long-term success of the agreement. The negotiation process was punctuated by periods of tension and even renewed fighting. Frontline commanders understood that ceasefire talks did not guarantee immediate peace. Skirmishes, artillery duels, and patrol clashes continued, often influenced by the political dynamics of the negotiations. Both sides sought to maintain leverage at the bargaining table by demonstrating military strength and readiness, creating a delicate balance between diplomacy and ongoing combat. By late 1952, after more than a year of intermittent talks, sufficient consensus had been reached to formalize the framework of an armistice. The agreement included a ceasefire, the establishment of a DMZ approximately 2 kilometers wide, and provisions for repatriation of prisoners of war, albeit with compromises on both sides. Technical details regarding observation, monitoring, and enforcement were meticulously drafted to reduce the likelihood of immediate violations. The armistice negotiations underscored several key lessons about the Korean War. First, even in conflicts characterized by ideological intensity and extreme violence, diplomacy remained essential. Second, stalemate on the battlefield did not imply futility. Careful negotiation could channel military exhaustion into political resolution. Third, the human dimension, particularly the treatment of POWs and the welfare of civilians, played a decisive role in shaping the agreement. While the armistice would not be signed until July 1953, the beginning of negotiations in 1951 marked a turning point. It represented the recognition that the Korean War, despite its brutality and the involvement of superpowers, was increasingly unsustainable as an open-ended military conflict. The talks laid the foundation for a negotiated settlement that would end active combat, even if underlying political tensions remained unresolved. In conclusion, the start of armistice negotiations in 1951 was a critical phase of the Korean War. It reflected the realities of attritional warfare, the strategic limits of military power, and the enduring importance of diplomacy. Although the fighting continued on the front lines for years, the initiation of talks marked the first serious effort to transform battlefield stalemate into a structured political resolution, setting the stage for the eventual armistice and the enduring division of the Korean Peninsula. From the very beginning of the Korean War, air power played a decisive and often underappreciated role in shaping the course of the conflict. While ground forces carried the brunt of combat and naval forces provided crucial support along Korea's coasts, control of the skies became a critical factor in determining strategic and tactical outcomes. From reconnaissance and close air support to strategic bombing campaigns, the Korean War marked one of the first conflicts in which air superiority, integration with ground operations, and rapid deployment of aircraft were central to modern warfare. At the onset of the war, in June 1950, the North Korean People's Army, KPA, advanced swiftly, threatening to overrun South Korea. One of the early advantages for UN forces was control of the air, primarily held by the United States Air Force, USAF, and the U.S. Navy. UN aircraft dominated the skies over South Korea, conducting reconnaissance missions to track enemy movements, identify concentrations of troops, and locate supply lines. This intelligence was critical for planning the defensive positions at the Pusan Perimeter and later for executing the audacious Inchon landing. The role of air power extended beyond reconnaissance. Close air support, CAS, became a vital tool for ground forces under threat. Fighter bombers, including the F-80 Shooting Star and later the F-86 Sabre, provided precision strikes against advancing North Korean units, tanks, artillery, and fortifications. The ability to quickly deploy aircraft to respond to rapidly changing battlefield conditions allowed UN commanders to stabilize critical sectors, particularly during the early defensive stages of the war. One of the most significant aspects of air power was interdiction operations. Aircraft targeted enemy supply lines, bridges, railways, and convoys, disrupting the movement of North Korean reinforcements and equipment. These strikes slowed the KPA's advance, allowing ground forces to regroup and fortify positions. By cutting off logistical support, air operations effectively reduced the combat effectiveness of North Korean units, demonstrating the strategic potential of air dominance in modern warfare. During the Pusan Perimeter defense, UN air power was indispensable. The KPA relied on tank and infantry advances to break through defensive lines, but aerial attacks inflicted severe losses. Fighter bombers strafed tank columns, bombed bridges, and disrupted troop movements, buying critical time for ground forces to hold key positions. Naval aircraft, operating from aircraft carriers off the Korean coast, extended the reach of UN air operations, providing additional firepower and flexibility in targeting enemy concentrations. The Inchon landing highlighted the integration of air power into large-scale operations. Before and during the amphibious assault, UN aircraft conducted sustained bombardments of enemy positions, coastal defenses, and supply depots. This pre-landing air campaign reduced resistance on the beaches, allowed for more rapid troop deployment, and minimized casualties. Furthermore, aircraft provided real-time reconnaissance, enabling commanders to adapt to unexpected enemy movements and maintain the element of surprise. As UN forces advanced north after Inchon, air power became increasingly critical in both offensive and defensive operations. During the push toward the Yalu River, reconnaissance missions provided intelligence on Chinese troop movements, while fighter bombers struck concentrations of enemy forces, bridges, and transportation hubs. The mountainous terrain of northern Korea posed challenges for ground mobility, but aircraft could bypass obstacles and deliver firepower precisely where it was needed. The entry of Chinese forces in late 1950 dramatically altered the dynamics of air warfare in Korea. Chinese troops, often moving at night or through rugged terrain, sought to avoid detection, but UN air superiority allowed reconnaissance planes to identify concentrations and relay intelligence to ground commanders. Tactical airstrikes disrupted Chinese supply lines, slowed advances, and forced them to adopt unconventional movement patterns. Despite harsh winter conditions, UN pilots flew relentlessly, often facing severe weather, anti-aircraft fire, and challenging terrain. One of the defining elements of air power in the Korean War was the advent of jet-to-jet combat. The North Korean Air Force initially relied on Soviet-supplied MiG-15 jets, which posed a serious threat to UN forces. The F-86 Sabre, deployed by the USAF, became the primary counter, engaging MiGs in dogfights over what became known as MiG Alley near the Yalu River. These high-speed aerial battles represented a new era of jet warfare, combining advanced technology, pilot skill, and tactical coordination. Control of the skies in these sectors was vital for maintaining air superiority and protecting ground forces from enemy air attacks. Air power also played a humanitarian and logistical role. Transport aircraft, such as the C-119 Flying Boxcar and C-47 Skytrain, delivered supplies, ammunition, and medical equipment to forward positions, particularly in remote or mountainous areas. These flights allowed troops to maintain operational capability even when ground supply routes were disrupted. Evacuation of wounded personnel by air also saved countless lives, highlighting the multifaceted utility of air operations in modern warfare. Strategically, UN air power demonstrated several key lessons. Integration with ground and naval operations maximized the effectiveness of combined arms warfare. Rapid deployment, reconnaissance, and precision strikes could compensate for numerical or terrain disadvantages. Moreover, air dominance could disrupt enemy morale, logistics, and command structures, influencing the broader strategic environment beyond the immediate battlefield. However, air operations were not without challenges. Pilots faced extreme cold, high-altitude flying hazards, and poorly mapped terrain. Anti-aircraft fire, weather conditions, and the risk of mechanical failure posed constant dangers. Additionally, coordination with ground forces required clear communication and real-time intelligence, which was not always available in chaotic combat environments. Despite these obstacles, UN air forces adapted quickly, developing tactics and procedures that enhanced their operational impact. The legacy of air power in the Korean War is profound. It demonstrated the critical role of air superiority in modern conflicts, the integration of jet technology into combat operations and the importance of reconnaissance, interdiction, and close air support. The Korean War became a testing ground for doctrines that would shape subsequent conflicts, including Vietnam and the Cold War era strategic planning. It also underscored the human dimension, the skill, endurance, and courage of pilots operating in extreme conditions, often in life or death situations. In conclusion, the role of air power in the Korean War was multifaceted and indispensable, from reconnaissance and interdiction to close air support and jet combat. Aircraft provided tactical flexibility, strategic advantage, and critical support for ground operations. Air operations not only influenced the outcome of battles, but also shaped the broader trajectory of the conflict. The Korean War stands as a seminal example of modern air warfare, highlighting the interplay of technology, strategy, and human resilience in one of the 20th century's most challenging military campaigns. While the Korean War is often remembered for its intense land battles and dramatic air engagements, the naval component played an equally critical role in shaping the conflict. Control of the seas allowed the United Nations to project power, supply forces, execute amphibious assaults, and maintain strategic flexibility. From the initial defense of the Pusan Perimeter to the audacious Inchon landing and beyond, naval operations were indispensable to the UN war effort, influencing both tactical and strategic outcomes. At the outset of the war, in June 1950, North Korean forces advanced rapidly into South Korea. The United States Navy, alongside allied navies from Britain, Australia, and Canada, quickly established a blockade of the Korean coastline. This blockade prevented North Korean forces from receiving reinforcements and supplies via sea, severely constraining their operational capabilities. By controlling the waters around the peninsula, the UN effectively denied the enemy freedom of movement and exerted constant pressure on coastal positions. One of the most dramatic demonstrations of naval power was the Inchon landing in September 1950. This amphibious assault, masterminded by General Douglas MacArthur, relied heavily on naval capabilities to transport troops, provide fire support, and secure beachheads. The challenging tidal conditions at Inchon, extreme fluctuations of water levels, and narrow channels required precise coordination among warships, landing craft, and troop transports. Battleships and cruisers bombarded enemy fortifications, clearing the way for Marines and soldiers to land with minimal resistance. The success of Inchon was as much a naval achievement as it was a ground operation, demonstrating the strategic impact of maritime forces in a land-centered conflict. Naval forces also played a crucial role in sustaining UN ground operations. Korea's mountainous terrain and limited infrastructure made overland supply routes slow, vulnerable, and difficult to maintain. The Navy provided secure maritime logistics, transporting troops, ammunition, food, and medical supplies directly to ports along the peninsula. This capability allowed UN forces to maintain operational tempo, reinforce positions, and recover from setbacks, such as the Pusan Perimeter defense. Without secure sea lines of communication, the rapid advances of UN forces following Inchon would have been far more difficult, if not impossible. In addition to logistical support, the Navy provided artillery firepower from the sea. Coastal bombardments targeted North Korean troop concentrations fortifications, and supply depots. The use of naval guns allowed UN forces to strike enemy positions deep inland, disrupting communications, destroying equipment, and softening defenses before infantry assaults. This capability was particularly important during the Inchon landing and subsequent operations near coastal cities, demonstrating how naval artillery could complement land-based forces in combined arms operations. Naval aviation also contributed significantly. Aircraft carriers, such as the USS Valley Forge and USS Philippine Sea, deployed carrier-based planes to provide close air support, reconnaissance, and interdiction missions. These aircraft extended the reach of UN forces beyond the immediate battlefield, striking targets that were otherwise inaccessible due to rugged terrain or distance from land-based airfields. Carrier-based air power enhanced operational flexibility, allowing commanders to respond quickly to emerging threats or exploit enemy vulnerabilities. Blockade and interdiction operations were another critical aspect of UN naval activity. By patrolling coastal waters and enforcing maritime control, UN navies prevented North Korean forces from moving reinforcements, equipment, or supplies by sea. This limitation forced the KPA to rely on overland routes, which were slower, more vulnerable to airstrikes, and increasingly ineffective as the war progressed. Naval dominance thus amplified the effectiveness of UN air and ground operations, creating a coordinated pressure that overwhelmed North Korean logistical and strategic capabilities. Amphibious capabilities extended beyond major operations like Inchon. Smaller landing craft and troop transports were used to execute limited raids, insert reconnaissance teams, and support special operations. These operations disrupted enemy communications, gathered intelligence, and applied psychological pressure, demonstrating the versatility of naval assets in both large-scale and targeted actions. The ability to strike from the sea added unpredictability to UN operations, forcing North Korean and later Chinese forces to defend not just their front lines, but also vulnerable coastal approaches. Naval operations also supported evacuation and medical efforts. In contested areas or during retreats, the Navy facilitated the extraction of wounded soldiers, civilians, and stranded personnel. Hospital ships, such as the USS Consolation, provided mobile medical support, ensuring that casualties received timely care and could return to service if possible. This capability not only saved lives, but also maintained morale among troops, reinforcing confidence in the UN's operational capacity. One of the most strategic aspects of naval involvement was its deterrent effect on Chinese intervention along the coast. The presence of powerful UN naval forces limited the options available to Chinese commanders for seaborne operations and reinforced the ability of UN forces to project power into northern ports if required. While the Chinese intervention ultimately occurred overland through the Yalu River region, naval dominance created a strategic buffer along the western and southern coasts, shaping the theater of operations and constraining enemy maneuverability. The Korean War also served as a testing ground for modern naval warfare concepts. The integration of aircraft carriers, amphibious assault ships, and gunfire support demonstrated the synergy between sea-based power projection and joint operations. Commanders learned to coordinate logistics, firepower, and intelligence across multiple domains: air, land, and sea, foreshadowing future conflicts where naval operations would play a central role in expeditionary warfare. Despite the effectiveness of UN naval operations, challenges remained. Mines laid by North Korean forces threatened shipping lanes, requiring specialized minesweeping operations to maintain access to ports. Harsh weather, including typhoons and winter storms, complicated navigation and resupply. Additionally, coordination between multinational navies demanded clear communication, standardized procedures, and joint planning to avoid missteps or friendly fire incidents. These challenges highlighted the complexity of sustaining naval operations in a dynamic, high-intensity conflict. The legacy of naval operations in Korea is profound. The Korean War demonstrated that control of the sea can decisively shape land campaigns, support air operations, and sustain extended military engagements. Naval power enabled bold maneuvers like Inchon, protected supply lines, and provided flexible platforms for both combat and humanitarian operations. The war also illustrated the importance of integrating naval capabilities into broader strategic planning, a lesson that continues to influence military doctrine worldwide. In conclusion, naval operations in the Korean War were indispensable to the success of UN forces, from amphibious assaults and coastal bombardments to logistical support and air operations. The Navy provided critical capabilities that complemented ground and air forces. Its dominance ensured operational flexibility, sustained advances, and the ability to respond to unexpected developments on the battlefield. The Korean War stands as a powerful example of how control of the seas can influence the course of a land-centric conflict, highlighting the enduring strategic importance of naval power in modern warfare. Life for soldiers during the Korean War was a harsh blend of discipline, danger, and endurance. The conflict's extreme conditions, scorching summers, freezing winters, and mountainous terrain, created a continuous physical and mental challenge. Soldiers lived in trenches, foxholes, and temporary bunkers, constantly exposed to artillery fire, sniper attacks, and unpredictable weather. Basic necessities such as food, water, and shelter were never guaranteed, and troops quickly adapted to improvisation as a survival skill. Daily life revolved around routine patrols, sentry duty, and fortifying positions, punctuated by occasional skirmishes or large-scale attacks. The monotony of long periods without combat was psychologically taxing, while intense battles demanded courage and rapid decision-making. Soldiers often witnessed the loss of comrades and endured injuries themselves, all while coping with frostbite, dysentery, or heat exhaustion. Letters from home, camaraderie, and small comforts like tobacco or coffee became vital for morale. Medical support was limited but critical. Field medics worked under fire, treating wounds with scarce resources, while evacuation often depended on air or ground transport through hostile terrain. Troops learned to survive with minimal supplies, and ingenuity became as important as discipline. Despite the brutality, soldiers developed close bonds, creating a support network that helped them endure the relentless pressures of frontline life. Propaganda was a crucial weapon in the Korean War, shaping both domestic opinion and the morale of enemy forces. Both sides used radio broadcasts, leaflets, and loudspeakers to influence perceptions, encourage defection, and undermine the opposing side's will to fight. The UN focused on portraying the war as a defense of democracy and freedom, while North Korea and China emphasized anti-imperialist rhetoric and the righteousness of communism. Leaflets were dropped behind enemy lines, urging soldiers to surrender and promising humane treatment. Radio broadcasts relayed stories of victories and ideological messaging, attempting to create doubt among frontline troops. Propaganda also played a role domestically. In the U.S., newspapers and newsreels highlighted UN successes, while China and North Korea reinforced patriotic commitment and unity. Psychological warfare added a subtle but effective layer to conventional combat, influencing decisions, morale, and the strategic environment without firing a shot. Korea's geography heavily influenced the conduct of the war. Mountainous regions, narrow valleys, rivers, and limited road networks made mobility and logistics extremely challenging. Steep ridges offered natural defensive positions, while rivers and valleys became choke points that could halt advances or create deadly ambushes. Soldiers had to navigate rugged terrain while carrying heavy equipment, and vehicles often struggled on poorly maintained roads. Terrain dictated strategy. High ground was critical for observation and artillery placement, while rivers required careful planning for crossings. Seasonal changes amplified challenges. Freezing winters created icy slopes and frostbite hazards, while rainy monsoons turned hills into mud traps. Commanders adapted by integrating engineering units, using air resupply, and relying on local guides. Korea's geography didn't just host the conflict, it shaped every battle, forcing armies to fight not just the enemy, but the land itself. The Korean War posed unprecedented medical challenges for soldiers and medical staff. Harsh weather, rugged terrain, and the intensity of combat caused injuries beyond gunshots and shrapnel. Frostbite, hypothermia, heat stroke, and disease were constant threats. Cold winters were especially brutal, with temperatures plunging below 30 degrees during battles like Chosin Reservoir, causing limbs to freeze and equipment to malfunction. Medical personnel had to improvise solutions while under fire, often saving lives in near impossible conditions. Field hospitals were established close to the front lines, sometimes in makeshift shelters or repurposed buildings. Medics and doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize the wounded before evacuation, frequently relying on limited supplies and basic surgical tools. Air evacuation became crucial, with transport planes moving casualties to rear hospitals for advanced care. Despite the challenges, medical innovations and rapid evacuation protocols improved survival rates compared to earlier conflicts. Though casualty numbers remained high, the human cost of the war was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed, wounded, or missing in action. Beyond the battlefield, civilians suffered from displacement, starvation, and lack of medical care. The scale of suffering highlighted not only the brutality of modern warfare, but also the importance of logistics, medical support, and planning. Soldiers' resilience, combined with the dedication of medical teams, became a defining feature of survival during the conflict. Intelligence played a critical role in the Korean War, shaping strategy, troop movements, and operational decisions. Both the UN and communist forces employed spies, reconnaissance units, and signals interception to gather critical information about enemy positions, supply lines, and plans. The mountainous terrain and dense forests made traditional scouting difficult, increasing the importance of human intelligence, HUMINT, and aerial reconnaissance. Forces relied heavily on aerial photography, capturing detailed images of enemy fortifications, troop concentrations, and supply routes. Signals intelligence, including radio interception and code breaking, provided insight into North Korean and Chinese communications. Conversely, communist forces used infiltration, disguised operatives, and surveillance to disrupt UN operations, gather strategic data, and feed propaganda. Intelligence often determined the outcome of key engagements. Foreknowledge of troop movements allowed commanders to prepare ambushes, reinforce weak points, or coordinate artillery and airstrikes effectively. Yet espionage carried inherent risk. Misinformation, deception, and double agents complicated decision making. The Korean War demonstrated that battlefield success depended as much on knowledge and anticipation as on firepower. Logistics were the lifeblood of the Korean War, influencing mobility, strategy, and sustainability. Korea's mountainous terrain and limited infrastructure made the movement of troops, weapons, and supplies extremely difficult. UN forces relied heavily on maritime supply routes, transporting essentials via naval convoys to ports along the peninsula. Overland transport often required trucks, railways, and even human porters, particularly in remote or mountainous regions. Supply lines were a constant target. Enemy forces attempted to disrupt logistics through ambushes, raids, and sabotage. Maintaining uninterrupted supply required careful planning, fortified routes, and coordination between air, land, and sea units. Weather played a significant role. Heavy rains turned roads into mud traps, while winter snow and ice blocked passes and froze equipment. Efficient logistics enabled sustained operations such as the Inchon landing and the subsequent push toward the Yalu River. Conversely, when supply lines faltered, units became vulnerable to counterattacks, shortages, and fatigue. The Korean War highlighted that wars are often won or lost, not just on the battlefield, but in the meticulous planning, execution, and protection of supply networks. The Korean War caused immense suffering for civilians caught in the crossfire. Millions were displaced as cities and villages were bombed or overrun, forcing families to flee to makeshift refugee camps. Many lost homes, land, and livelihoods, and food shortages, disease, and exposure compounded their suffering. Civilians often faced difficult choices: cooperate with occupying forces, hide from the conflict, or risk joining the exodus to safer areas. Urban centers became particularly dangerous. Strategic bombing by UN aircraft and artillery strikes designed to target military infrastructure sometimes destroyed residential neighborhoods. Rural areas were equally affected, as battles over high ground and supply routes brought violence to farmlands and villages. The war fractured communities, disrupted education and health services, and left lasting trauma for generations. Civilian casualties and displacement also influenced the conduct of military operations. Armies had to consider refugee movements, the risk of guerrilla activity, and the need to secure humanitarian corridors. International aid organizations were limited in their reach due to ongoing fighting, emphasizing the challenge of balancing military objectives with civilian safety. The human cost of the war extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping Korean society for decades to come. The Korean War was the first major armed conflict of the Cold War, drawing multiple nations into a proxy struggle between communism and democracy. The United Nations, spearheaded by the United States, mobilized a coalition including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Turkey, France, and others. These nations contributed troops, naval forces, air support, and logistical aid, highlighting Korea as a truly international conflict. On the opposing side, China provided the bulk of reinforcements alongside North Korean forces, with Soviet advisors and air support playing a key role. While Soviet troops were not officially deployed on the ground, they supplied advanced aircraft, weapons, and strategic guidance, directly influencing the war's trajectory. International involvement added layers of complexity. Command structures had to integrate multinational forces with different doctrines, equipment, and languages. Political considerations influenced military decisions, such as limiting the advance near Chinese territory to avoid escalation. The global nature of the war also heightened its stakes, making Korea a testing ground for Cold War strategies and alliances that would influence conflicts for decades. The Korean War showcased the evolution of modern warfare through the introduction and use of advanced technology and weaponry. Jet aircraft, such as the F-86 Sabre and MiG-15, dominated the skies in MiG Alley, introducing a new era of high-speed aerial combat. Helicopters were used extensively for medical evacuation and reconnaissance, enhancing battlefield mobility. Artillery, tanks, and mechanized infantry demonstrated the growing reliance on combined arms operations. Innovations like portable radios allowed better communication between units, while new weapons, including recoilless rifles and improved machine guns, provided infantry with enhanced firepower. Mines, booby traps, and fortifications emphasized defensive strategies, especially during stalemated trench warfare. However, technology also highlighted limitations. Harsh weather often rendered equipment ineffective, while rugged terrain slowed armored vehicles. Logistics had to account for fuel, spare parts, and maintenance, demonstrating that technological advantage alone could not guarantee success. Ultimately, the Korean War illustrated how innovation, when combined with strategic planning and human adaptability, shaped the outcome of modern conflicts. By 1952, both sides had recognized that a decisive victory in Korea was unlikely. The war had settled into a stalemate along the 38th parallel, with entrenched positions, attritional battles, and immense human cost. This reality, combined with mounting international and domestic pressure, set the stage for the final armistice negotiations that would ultimately bring an end to active fighting. Negotiations intensified in 1953, focusing on the key issues that had delayed progress for years. These included the exact location of a demilitarized zone, DMZ, the repatriation of prisoners of war, and mechanisms to enforce compliance with the ceasefire. Both sides were cautious, seeking to preserve strategic advantages while avoiding concessions that could be perceived as weakness. Military actions continued alongside diplomacy, but the ongoing exhaustion of troops and depletion of resources reinforced the need for resolution. The UN, Chinese, and North Korean delegations worked meticulously, drafting agreements, establishing inspection protocols, and defining the technical aspects of the DMZ. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed, ending hostilities while leaving Korea politically divided. Though not a formal peace treaty, the armistice marked the culmination of years of complex negotiations and brutal warfare, preserving the Korean Peninsula as two separate states and setting the stage for a tense but stable Cold War era standoff. The Korean War left a profound and enduring legacy both in military history and global geopolitics. It demonstrated the dangers of ideological conflict escalating into proxy wars, highlighted the evolving nature of modern combat, and underscored the human cost of warfare. The war also marked a turning point in Cold War strategy, establishing patterns of UN intervention, international coalition building, and limited wars fought to contain influence without triggering global escalation. On the battlefield, Korea illustrated the importance of combined arms operations, the integration of air, land, and naval forces, and the adaptation to harsh terrain and climate. Innovations in technology, such as jet aircraft, helicopters, and advanced artillery, redefined combat tactics. Commanders had to adapt to rapid maneuver warfare, trench-based stalemates, and the psychological challenges of high-intensity conflict, offering lessons that influenced later wars, like Vietnam. The human cost was staggering. Millions of soldiers and civilians were killed, wounded, or displaced. Korea's cities were devastated, infrastructure destroyed, and entire communities uprooted. The war also left deep political and social divisions, both within Korea and internationally. However, it also fostered resilience, innovation, and cooperation among UN forces, setting precedents for multinational military operations. Ultimately, the Korean War serves as a case study in endurance, strategy, and diplomacy. It demonstrated that even in a high-intensity, ideologically charged conflict, negotiation and compromise are essential to prevent indefinite destruction. Its lessons continue to influence military doctrine, international relations, and the understanding of war's human and technological dimensions. Now, with a smile on your face, you will have a good understanding of the Korean War and a good night's sleep. Goodbye, dear friend. See you next time.